Welcome to another episode of Business Talk, where we get to zoom into the lives and the big issues that business leaders are dealing with at the moment. We get to talk to the business leaders shaping their industries, and really, my next guest is one who's dealing with some of the biggest issues in the world at the moment. If you look at the Freedom House Project's 2021 Freedom in the World assessment, 2020 saw a sharp acceleration in the global decline of democracy. Now, by their measure, fewer than a fifth of the world's population now live in fully free countries. Think about that. 1 in 5 people live in fully fledged free democratic countries. Why is this happening? Well, the Monocle CEO, David Buckham, it's a great pleasure to have you back on the show. It's certainly a big question that you've looked at in your book, The End of Money, The Great Erosion of Trust in Banking, China's Minsky Moment, and the Fallacy of Cryptocurrency. We spoke about the book last October. Since then, I've seen it all over the place. It's got some great reviews. I read Giulietta Televi in the FM. What have people been saying about the book to you?
First of all, Michael, thank you so much for having me back on the season. We've had incredible feedback on the book. So we've had 3 physical launches, and we've had a lot of touch points with media. I'm really quite humbled by it. And people generally say that it's well researched, which I really like. And it's anchored in data. And people say that they find it readable, which I also really appreciate. I think I would like to believe that people understand the main point, which is that there's several forces taking place at the same time, that there's an erosion of trust in the banking system, in the Western liberal system, and a dangerously, well, we're moving towards a more authoritarian world. And I think people are getting that. Sometimes people have said it's a dense read. It's not necessarily an easy read, but we've had great feedback. We've actually just, Michael, done another big litho print because we literally sold out.
Well, that's always that's always a good sign. But it would be a dense read because it's so well researched from that perspective. But I also found the narrative very compelling and very easy to follow as you trace back what are these driving forces behind the overall decline of democracy. Why is there this distrust in the financial system? Why are we seeing strong men in Russia and China emerge? And really, those should be questions that keep us all up at night. Why is this happening fundamentally? We've had this rising authoritarianism that's been underway across the globe for the last 30 years. And that's why I mentioned it in my introduction. Considering the main themes in the book, what would you say, if you to look in the rearview mirror, that has happened in the last 4 months since the publication that has been surprising or unexpected in the world of finance, economics, and geopolitics?
I think, we published the book 18th of October is the official date. I think it hit the bookshelves 23rd October. So we had stopped writing right up to the day of print. We were still doing last minute edits, call it the end of September, roughly. So if I go back then, things that we didn't know but have turned out to be eerily true. The one would be the Ukraine. And the buildup of troops on the border of Ukraine, and also the use of Belarus. US also sending preliminary kind of troops. We're looking at 2 world powers that are. It's really not. It's something that we kind of thought might happen, an increase in totalitarianism and expansionism. That would be the one thing. The other thing I think that's really, really kind of blown my mind is how fast we predicted inflation. In the book, we talk about there must come inflation because of money supply, and we saw Jerome Powell, after we published the book, pivot away from the word transitory.
Yeah.
So he was saying that it was just going to be a short-term thing. It was a supply shock thing. And we kept saying that this guy is crazy. Sorry to say that on a recorded interview, to say that Jerome Powell's crazy. But I kind of stand by the point that he's not behaving in a way that's ideal for the monetary system. We have too much money, as you know, printed in the world. And we think inflation could be quite sustained, like several years. And the inflation data is actually coming out this afternoon. I'm waiting to see if it's 7 plus or 7.
1982. 1982 was the last time I expected to see inflation this hot in the US. I think Eye of the Tiger was on the top of the charts back then. I mean, that's what we're talking. And interestingly, you know, speaking of the prescience in that particular part of the book, I've noticed a growing number of over-the-ditch European central bank policymakers losing faith in that institution's current inflation forecasting. So they're saying, right, guys, we actually don't trust the models at the moment. And that's really emboldening their shift towards hiking rates later this year, 25 bips, the market's saying. So, you know, what does this mean then? If we're seeing now a rising inflation into a world that's trying to grow out of a pandemic, but increasingly now dealing with forces of authoritarianism building up in Eastern Europe and Russia and China as well. It all leads one to feel very uncertain in the world, like something's got to give pretty soon.
Yeah, I think for me, we've got an immediate problem where the Fed says, so we're seeing US inflation at 7%, the highest since 1982. So that's number one. Number two, we've got money supply at 3 times, there's 3 times more money in the world than there was in 2005. So we've never tested, you know, a classic monetary economic theory in a world with 3 times more money. So no kind of open market operations activity or normal 25 basis point moves, even if there's 5 of them, would work. So for example, let's think about it. The yield of the 10-year government bond in the US is now 1.9%. It was a month ago 1.6%. So if the yield has gone up, the price has gone down. So the faith in the 10-year bond has gone down as an asset of just the last month. So take 1.9% and imagine that the federal funds rate goes from 25 basis points, let's say it goes 5 times to 1.5%. So 5 rate changes during the course of 2022. The real yield on the 10-year bond right now is minus 0.48%, 48 pips negative real yield. So money has a negative yield right now. And as inflation goes up, so the negativity of the real yield will go down. So they need to move rates by 50 basis points 5 times, which is what 2 big banks suggested in the last 24 hours. Goldman Sachs said 2.5% at the end of 2022. So now you're going to do 5 interest rate shocks on a pandemic market, and you're still not going to be there.
What happens to the US economy with its debt to GDP of 130 to 140%? Debt service costs now absolutely are going through the roof, as we're seeing in the 10-year and what the market's saying there. It does create a real political headache where the central bank's almost on the horns of a dilemma here and is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't.
I think like the addiction is already the addict, which is the US economy. And we are going to fall foul of being, the lowly cousin of the US economy. The addict is the US economy. The body economic is addicted to OxyContin. And they can't just switch off the OxyContin because the US economy will go crazy. It will be mayhem. That will be a return to the financial crisis. So they've got to take the body economic off the drip, off the drug slowly.
Slowly, yeah.
My concern is that Jerome Powell's been too slow. So the more he's running out of legroom, I think. And my concern is there's a tipping point where inflation just goes sky high, where it translates into, because they're at full, the US also, this is really interesting. This is not in the book. And, if I could go back 4 months, I would put this in the book. The US is running at full employment. Mm-hmm. So when you have full employment and, for example, you can't find people to work in your coffee shop. You can't find people to wash the cars. Or you can't find people to do the many thousands of jobs that need to be done. Yep. You have wage inflation. And that's not transitory. So once you have wage inflation, you can get to a point like the 1980s where it spirals out of control.
Yeah.
And you've also got the Biden administration sort of really hanging on for dear life right now. So financial disruption leads to political and economic disruption, leads to possible geopolitical concerns. And it's so interesting, when we're writing the book, to watch them exit Afghanistan was heartbreaking. It was a project.
But let's bring it back to how this plays into Eastern Europe, because I'm not sure how many people actually realize or understand the history here between Russia and Ukraine. When you've got Vladimir Putin standing up and saying, we speak the same language, well, that is highly inflammatory to Ukrainian people who are trying to break away from the old United Soviet state model after years of being under Moscow's thumb. They wanted to integrate into Europe. They were pivoting to the EU, and we've seen wars fought over this. But it's at its heart, it's an energy issue as well, because the Russian economy is as a resource-based economy. They want to export their gas to Eastern Europe. They've got to get it through Ukraine. Ukraine was making a nice little rent of doing that. And now all of a sudden you've got this new gas pipeline, Nord Stream 2, that was going to basically bypass Ukraine and pipe Russian gas straight to Germany. Now, US President Biden is saying, no, we'll block that. Well, Germany is a European manufacturing powerhouse. They rely quite heavily on that gas, 28 million households. It becomes a really tricky situation to navigate. And underlying all of that, it's going to drive inflation. We see where gas prices are in Europe.
I think it's exactly, the concern, like as you've laid it out, is we live in a completely different world to the one that we lived in 10 years ago. The geopolitics of today is unique for today. And if you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, the leadership in the Western world did not at that time allow for authoritarianism. And in allowing Putin to participate in the global landscape. And Michael, it is interesting if you watch the Olympics, which are being held in Beijing of all places, and then you watch. I particularly find the cross-country skiing very interesting because it's such a tough race where they do 15Ks and then 15Ks in a different style of skis. And ROC, the Russian Olympic Committee athletes, that Russian Olympic Committee athletes, the fact that they are not Russia, that they don't have a nationality, is a result actually of two things. The one is cheating at the Olympics, which is doping, but mainly the sanctions, the US sanctions. So, when Putin last invaded and got land, which he still, the Crimea, there were sanctions, and we're seeing Putin. Russia has the GDP the same size as Spain. It's not a particularly powerful economic force in the world, but Putin is punching above his weight.
David, talking about all of these issues, and there's that dystopian sort of scene of that ski slope next to a power station, and it just reminds you of just how abnormal the world is actually at the moment, and how globally we've allowed previous regimes that wouldn't have been allowed to play within the global order. We've allowed them entrance, and now they're using that, and they're seeking to use that to influence their sphere, their sphere of geopolitical influence beyond even their economic might, as you say, Putin punching above his weight. In the book, you highlight many of the risks, and some of these are exactly those that you highlight that are now coming to pass. Given the success of the book in the last 4 months, where to from here? Because so much is changing so quickly. Surely there's got to be a follow-up. What's your next project? Do you have any plans for another book?
Yes, Michael, we do actually. We're really fascinated by the world at the moment, and really fascinated with some of the things that we missed, you could say, or some of the things that we want to highlight more. And particularly, I think the money supply and the question of inflation, full employment, and I think the macroeconomic, that model that doesn't quite work anymore, and the challenge facing Jerome Powell. So we've got a book in the works that we've already begun. We also want to highlight the enormous gap between, the inequality reports. The World Inequality Database has shown that in virtually every country in the world, inequality has increased. So we think there's a really interesting topic there. And I would like to believe that we could put some suggestions forward for how to fix things. And I mean, I know that's a very bold statement, but I can give you an example, like one specific example. In South Africa, we have the CCMA, which has been a great success in relative terms and in absolute terms for helping workers have rights in a country that previously was one of the worst countries in the world under the apartheid regime. I mean, the CCMA has provided people with an immediate fast track where no matter how powerful your company is and how powerful your lawyers are, you can go to the CCMA and the CEO has to pitch up there with his powerful lawyers, but you still have to sit with the judge. And it's really a great success. Imagine a kind of CCMA in every country for antitrust, for competition law, which put people who created monopolies in front of a judge within weeks, put them in prison within months. I think we would have fewer problems with broadcast platforms, polarization of ideas. So that's just one idea that we want to put forward as a practical idea. Why can't we have a fast-track antitrust law with courts?
I think it's an interesting idea that I'd love to explore further with you, because I do think a lot of where we find the polarization in today's world can trace itself back to the rise of the internet, in particular social media platforms, which have, if you look at the way we would speak to each other down at the pub, I mean, you can make statements because of free speech, and I have rights to. But when that goes now into the broader community, and you start harming the group on the back under the guise of just free speech, for example, and you start weakening, the societal interest, well, I mean, that then goes against the broader good and health of the group. And ultimately, it traces back to a very interesting book that I read by Neil Ferguson in The Square and the Tower, where they thought when the Gutenberg printing press was invented, this was going to spread the good book around the world. And ultimately what it did was it led to the 100-Year War, because falsehoods, myths, mysticism, occultism was spread and people were burnt at the stake. increasingly we're seeing with social media, the ability to polarize based on algorithms and people with the same ideologies and ideas gathering together. So these are very powerful forces. And I do think we need a market correcting mechanism there. We can't just leave these forces to their own devices. So I think it's a very interesting.
This is precisely the idea, Michael, is that we tend to kind of, well, let me put it slightly different. I believe that one of the biggest problems that is feeding into all of the geopolitical problems and all of the lack of trust or destruction of trust problems is the polarization that's taking place owing to Silicon Valley basically owning the narrowcasting to our brains. And if you go back 30, 40 years, there were small newspapers. There was a lot of cultural difference. You know, there was a lot of information difference. The Gini coefficient of information was high. Now we have a very small Gini coefficient. There's not a lot of, and it's very polarized, and it's monetized, and it's weaponized. And I think it was done in an antitrust way. So that's the main point that we're trying to carry into the 22s.
Wow, really looking forward to that one. And if I can help, give me a shout. I'll squeeze it in.
We'd love some help.
Fantastic. David Buckham, CEO.
Thank you, Michael, for having me.
As always a great pleasure having you on the show. Really stimulating viewpoints, and you always leave me thinking about something more than when I started chatting to you. So I look forward to our next chat. Take care.
Thank you, Michael, so much. Really enjoy this. Thank you so much.